The air was thick with the low hum of late-night city sounds, muffled yet pressing. I was alone, or at least I thought I was, as I crossed the empty parking lot beneath the flickering streetlights. Just as I reached my car, my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from an unknown number. "We know what you're looking into. Drop it." It was the third message that week, and each one seemed to carry a heavier weight. The more I ignored them, the darker the warnings became, as if someone was reaching through the screen, breathing down my neck, daring me to continue. But I couldn't stop, not now. I was too deep in, too close to something far more sinister than I'd anticipated. It started out innocently, as it always does. Just a few lines of curiosity, a hint of mystery. How could I have guessed that those names, Diddy, Michael Jackson, were part of a much larger web, one that stretched into the shadows of the industry, pulling the strings of fame, power, and, in some cases, life itself? I knew the danger was real, my gut twisted with the kind of fear that claws at you, lingering even after the sun rises, but I couldn't turn away, not after what I'd learned. How deep did it go? And who was watching my every move, ready to silence anyone who got too close to the truth? I'd grown up idolizing the legends, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Tupac. They were larger than life, untouchable icons who, for all their glamour, had a mystery about them that kept the world hooked. So when I got the chance to work with Diddy, I thought I'd made it. I felt like I was brushing shoulders with history, slipping into a world I'd only ever seen on magazine covers and television screens. I told myself I was lucky, but luck has its own price, and sometimes you pay without even realizing it. From day one, the music industry felt different. I'd expected it to be bustling, lively, filled with chatter and energy. Instead, the halls were quiet, and people spoke in low voices, casting cautious glances over their shoulders before even whispering something as trivial as the day's schedule. The vibe was thick with secrecy, like there was an unspoken rule to never ask questions that went beyond the music. I laughed it off at first, chalking it up to eccentricity. After all, I'd heard about the eccentricities of Hollywood. But this was something else. One afternoon, as I passed a dimly lit corridor near Diddy's office, I caught two of his closest aides deep in conversation. They were whispering, huddled close, and I could just make out fragments of what they were saying. Michael Jackson, he knew too much. The words sent a shiver down my spine. They noticed me watching, and their faces darkened instantly. One of them, a seasoned manager, shot me a look that was equal parts warning and pity. "Keep your head down if you want to last," he muttered, before turning away. I couldn't shake it. What did they mean? He knew too much? Wasn't Michael's death a tragic accident? The end of a legend gone too soon? The look in their eyes said otherwise. And from that moment on, I felt a crack in the glamorous facade I'd been so enchanted by. There was something more, something dark lingering beneath the surface of fame and fortune. A hidden cost I was only beginning to understand. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized there were people willing to do anything to keep those secrets buried. The deeper I dug into Diddy's world, the stranger things became. One day, as I sorted through paperwork in the back office, a task that was as mundane as it was routine, I came across something unusual. Amid stacks of contracts and event schedules, there was a thin, unmarked folder that had clearly been out of place. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside were copies of confidential documents from a legal case. I skimmed through, my eyes landing on names and details that seemed disconnected, until one name stopped me cold. Michael Jackson. According to the documents, there had been questions surrounding Michael's finances, his will, even his medical records in the weeks before his death. But one section caught my eye. It hinted at an arrangement involving multiple parties, one of whom was listed under a code name that corresponded to Diddy's business alias. The language was vague, but it was clear enough. Michael Jackson had been entangled in a web far darker than the world knew. I felt a chill creep over me. The documents hinted at unseen forces with influence over Jackson's affairs, a network that would see to it that Michael's legacy remained controlled. It sounded unbelievable, conspiratorial even, but these weren't rumors or fan theories. These were official confidential documents that someone had tried to keep hidden. I closed the folder, my mind reeling. What kind of forces had that kind of power? And how could they reach a man like Michael? Then, a memory surfaced. I remembered a story I'd overheard from one of Diddy's longtime associates, someone who had been with him from the early days. They said that in his last days, Michael had begun confiding in a select few about forces in the industry that pulled the strings, controlling artists like puppets. According to the story, Michael had become increasingly paranoid, saying he felt trapped, like he was being watched. There are things you can't see, things that hold you, he had allegedly told them, his voice almost a whisper. If you don't play the game, you disappear. It was hard to imagine the king of pop, a global icon, brought down not just by scandal, but by forces so insidious they could control even him. But now, with these papers in front of me, I was starting to see a different picture. This wasn't just about power and fame. It was about control, and those who couldn't be controlled, they were removed, erased. A few days after finding the folder, I received a call from someone I'd never met, someone who claimed to have known Michael in his final days. They wanted to meet, saying they had something important to share. We met in a crowded cafe, the kind of place where every table is occupied and people don't pay attention to strangers. The man was older, his face etched with lines of worry, and his hands trembled as he spoke. Michael was afraid, he said, his voice low. He was afraid of them. He used to talk about an invisible network, people who could make or break you with a single phone call. In his last days, he was trying to escape, trying to warn others, but he knew it was too late. I listened, the weight of his words settling like a stone in my chest. What did he mean by them? I asked. The man shook his head. Powerful people, the ones who control everything behind the scenes. He didn't trust anyone, not even his own staff. He said that if he tried to tell the truth, he wouldn't make it out alive. He paused, his eyes growing distant. He used to say, "Fame isn't freedom, it's a prison." The words echoed in my mind long after we parted. It was hard to accept, but something told me I'd stumbled into something that went far deeper than I'd ever anticipated. This wasn't just about one man's death. It was about a hidden machine that used artists as pawns, feeding off their fame and discarding them when they became inconvenient. Michael Jackson's legacy had always been one of greatness and mystery. But now, it seemed there was a side to his story that the world was never meant to know, and as the pieces began to fall into place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I'd seen something I wasn't meant to see. As I delved deeper into the story, I realized Michael Jackson wasn't the only one who had supposedly fallen victim to these unseen forces. Whispered names of other artists, Aaliyah, Lisa Left Eye Lopez, surfaced in conversations, each one tied to dark rumors that went beyond the official reports of their deaths. I started to see a pattern emerging, a chillingly familiar rhythm to each story. These were artists who, like Michael, had seemed to reach a point where they no longer fit the mold the industry had made for them. They had started asking questions, challenging the norms, and before long, they were gone. Aaliyah's name came up first. She'd been a star, rising faster than anyone expected, her talent and beauty magnetic. But people whispered about how she had changed in her final months. She was more guarded, more withdrawn, as if something weighed heavily on her. In a private conversation, one of Diddy's associates mentioned that Aaliyah had been resistant. I caught the word before they quickly changed the subject. Their tone clipped, as if they'd said too much. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that word used in reference to a star who had died under strange circumstances. The story of Lisa Left Eye Lopes was even more unsettling. Known for her wild spirit and raw honesty, Lisa had never been afraid to speak her mind. But it seemed that courage had come at a cost. In the months leading up to her death, she had allegedly started digging into the darker side of the industry, asking questions that no one wanted to answer. She'd even mentioned feeling like someone was watching her, like her movements were being monitored. The more I heard, the more it seemed Lisa's reputation as troubled had been shaped to hide the fact that she was, in reality, challenging something far more dangerous. I started piecing together fragments of conversations and whispered warnings I'd overheard. Certain words and phrases kept repeating, like pieces of a code I was slowly beginning to decipher. Know your place. Play by the rules. Don't ask questions. I remembered a time I'd heard two managers talking about the price of fame with a tone that was far from figurative. They get what's coming to them, one had muttered, his voice low and cold. When I asked what he meant, he just gave me a look, one that seemed to say, if you don't understand, you're better off not knowing. But the deeper I dug, the harder it was to ignore the patterns. Each of these artists had been outspoken, had resisted in their own way, and in each case, their careers and their lives had been cut short. It felt too coordinated, too calculated to be mere coincidence. And then there was the strangest part of all. In each instance, they had confided in someone before their deaths, mentioning fears that they were being watched or controlled. Their stories had echoes of Michael's final days, as if they had all brushed against the same invisible force that had ultimately destroyed them. One night, as I was trying to make sense of it all, I was approached by an older figure in the industry, a man who had known some of these artists before they died. His voice was cautious, almost a whisper, as he told me about the rules, the unspoken guidelines that everyone in the industry was expected to follow. "It's like a pact," he said, eyes darting around the room to make sure no one was listening. "There are things you can do, things you can't. Those who don't play by the rules, well, they pay for it." I felt a shiver go through me as he spoke. This was no conspiracy theory. The fear in his eyes was real, and it matched the fear I'd seen in the eyes of others who had been close to these lost artists. He told me about other names, ones that hadn't made headlines but had vanished quietly, their careers fizzling out after they'd been labeled as difficult or troubled. It was a label that, in this industry, seemed to be a kiss of death. And as he listed off names, each one a faint echo of the fame they once held, I began to understand that these rules were less about respect and more about control. Those who pushed back, who tried to claim their independence, were swiftly dealt with. The more I pieced together, the clearer it became that I was treading on dangerous ground. It was as if I was uncovering a machine that the industry relied on, a system designed to keep the power tightly held by those at the top. And if someone got too close to exposing that machine, they were discarded like broken parts, left as cautionary tales for anyone else who might think of stepping out of line. Aaliyah, Lisa Lopez, Michael Jackson. They were more than artists. They had become symbols, reminders to everyone in the industry that there was a line they could never cross. I couldn't shake the feeling that by learning their stories, by following the threads of their untimely deaths, I was getting too close to that line myself. And in the quiet moments, when I caught my reflection in darkened windows, I began to wonder if I'd end up like them, someone who knew too much, someone who had pushed just a bit too far. The turning point came one late evening in Diddy's office. Long after most of the staff had cleared out, I'd been summoned there by one of his assistants who'd simply told me that Mr. Combs wanted a word. The room was dimly lit, with just enough light to cast long shadows across the walls. Diddy sat behind his desk, his face unreadable, his fingers tapping an uneasy rhythm against the dark mahogany. He motioned for me to sit, his eyes meeting mine with a look that was both wary and oddly resigned. Without preamble, he slid a folder across the desk, his voice low. "You're digging around in places you don't belong," he said, almost to himself. "You need to understand, there are things in this industry you can't know, and people you can't mess with." Curiosity overtook my caution. I opened the folder, and what I saw froze me. There, on a list titled Protected Persons, were the names of artists, executives, and other influential figures. At the top were names I recognized immediately: Diddy, Jay-Z, Beyoncé. But the list didn't stop there. Scanning further, I saw names I hadn't expected, names of politicians, financiers, and behind-the-scenes power players. But the most chilling part was the other list on the second page, a shorter column with the header Compromised. Underneath were the names of those artists whose fates had always seemed mysterious: Michael Jackson, Aaliyah, Lisa Lopez. The implication was undeniable. There was a structure here, a hidden hierarchy. People at the top were shielded, protected, but for those who tried to step outside the line, the consequences were fatal. I looked up at Diddy, but his expression was hard, inscrutable. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Consider it a warning," he replied, his tone cold. "You've already seen too much, and you don't want to end up on the wrong side of this list." I left his office, my heart pounding, feeling as though the ground beneath me had shifted. Everything I'd suspected, the rumors, the whispers, the strange behavior, it was all true. This wasn't just an industry, it was a machine. And those who tried to challenge it, who didn't follow the rules, were quietly removed. The paranoia set in almost immediately. That night, as I left the building, I felt a pair of eyes on me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but the feeling wouldn't shake. On my way home, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I hesitated but picked up, hearing only silence on the other end before the line clicked dead. The next morning, I woke to another message on my phone. "You're in too deep. Turn back now." It was a different number, but the message was clear. Someone was watching, and they knew exactly what I'd uncovered. Over the next few days, the warnings intensified. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. I'd catch glimpses of people following me, only to have them disappear the moment I looked back. My phone rang at odd hours, the calls ending as soon as I picked up. And it wasn't just phone calls. A few nights later, I noticed a car parked outside my apartment, its headlights dimmed, someone sitting inside but never stepping out. When I went to check, the car sped off, leaving only the feeling of dread in its wake. At first, I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but then I started hearing the whispers. Friends and colleagues who'd once been friendly now seemed guarded, cautious around me. Some even warned me, quietly and indirectly. "Be careful what you get yourself into," one of them said, their voice barely audible. Not everyone makes it out when they start looking too closely. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was becoming clear. I was a target. Those I'd once trusted were distancing themselves, as though associating with me could make them vulnerable too. I began to understand that this wasn't just about one man or one list. I had crossed into dangerous territory, and if I kept pushing, there might not be a way back. A former mentor in the industry, someone I'd always looked up to, pulled me aside one afternoon. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting around the room, as if expecting someone to be listening. "This isn't the game you want to play," they warned. "Trust me on this one. There's a reason we don't ask questions, a reason we don't dig too deep." I felt a pang of betrayal. This was someone who had encouraged my curiosity, my ambition. Now, they were urging me to stop, to let go of the biggest story of my career. "Why don't you care?" I asked, my voice edged with frustration. They sighed, looking at me with a mix of pity and fear. "Because I know what happens if I do. I've seen too many people disappear, too many lives ruined. Fame isn't what it looks like. It's a cage, and the ones who control it, they don't care about any of us. You don't want to cross them. You don't want to be on their radar." But I was already there. Every conversation, every warning only deepened my resolve. These people had destroyed lives, had turned the industry I'd once idolized into a twisted machine of control, and they thought I'd just turn away. As I left the office that day, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the message, feeling a chill down my spine. "You're being watched. Last chance to walk away." The weight of the list burned in my memory, every name etched in my mind. They thought they could intimidate me into silence, that I'd be too afraid to expose them. But as I looked at the silent buildings around me, at the shadows cast by the fading light, I knew I was past the point of turning back. The threats only grew from there, a silent yet relentless pressure that seemed to seep into every part of my life. What started as anonymous calls and mysterious messages soon escalated into something far darker. Everywhere I went, there was an unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. It was in the cars that appeared too often in my rearview mirror, the faces that seemed to linger too long at a distance, and the faint shuffle of footsteps just a bit too close for comfort. I couldn't prove any of it, but I didn't need to. I could feel it, a cold weight pressing against my chest. At home, things were no better. My phone would buzz in the middle of the night, each message containing only a single word, as if it were a countdown. Stop, enough, last. I started to dread the silence that came after each message, the unnerving stillness that seemed to fill my apartment once the screen went dark. I knew they were warning me, trying to push me to the edge. One night, I arrived home to find my front door slightly ajar, the lock hanging loose, as if it had been forced. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, surveying the room, but nothing seemed out of place, until I reached my desk. There, right in the center, was the list, the same list I'd hidden away in a place no one should have known about. Now it was laid out, open, as though someone wanted to remind me just how easily they could reach me. A wave of panic set in. I checked every room, every corner, expecting to find some sign of who had been there, but there was nothing. Whoever had entered had been precise, clinical. They hadn't left a single trace. Just that list, positioned with chilling precision, its presence a silent warning. "We can get to you any time." From that night on, sleep became a luxury. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, every creak and shadow playing tricks on my mind. I'd hear faint sounds outside my window, a rustle, a faint whisper, and I'd lie still, my heart racing, straining to catch any sign of movement. My paranoia grew until I started avoiding people altogether, cutting off friends, colleagues, anyone who might unwittingly draw attention to themselves by being too close to me. I didn't want anyone else caught up in this, didn't want them to know the dread that haunted my every moment. But the worst came a few nights later. I'd returned home late, exhausted and on edge, when I noticed an envelope slipped under my door. It was unmarked, plain, with only my name written in sharp, deliberate letters. Inside, there was a USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive, left for me like an invitation I couldn't refuse. I took a deep breath and plugged it into my laptop. The screen flickered and a video file opened. It was grainy, but I recognized the place instantly. It was my own hallway, captured through some hidden camera. The video showed me entering my apartment, closing the door behind me, unaware of the camera recording my every move. I watched, horrified, as the footage showed me walking through each room, checking each lock, oblivious to the invisible eyes following me. Then, the camera angle changed, shifting to a shot from inside my apartment. It was a view of my living room, the place where I felt most secure. And as I watched, my own image on the screen, I saw something I'd missed. The subtle movement of a shadow just outside the window, watching. A figure stood there, obscured by darkness, their face hidden, but their presence unmistakable. They were watching, waiting, as I moved through the apartment. The video cut to black, leaving me sitting in the dark, paralyzed by fear. Whoever they were, they didn't just want me to know I was being watched. They wanted me to feel it, to know that there was no safe place left. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking. The realization hit me hard. They weren't just watching. They were playing with me, toying with my fear, drawing me deeper into a nightmare of their design. I found myself trapped in a spiral of isolation and doubt. Every instinct screamed at me to abandon the story, to walk away, and pretend I'd never seen that list, never discovered the horrifying reality behind the curtain of fame. But part of me, the part that had dedicated years to seeking truth, refused to let go. I'd started down this path, and now every step I took felt like a test of my own resolve, my commitment to uncovering what lay at the heart of it all. But the more I struggled with my decision, the more I felt the noose tightening. People in the industry who had once been allies now kept their distance, their glances wary, their smiles too tight. I overheard whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room, sensing the shift as people looked at me like I was already marked. The list's existence was a secret I could hardly keep to myself anymore, yet sharing it felt like a death sentence. One night, at the height of my desperation, I reached out to a trusted friend, someone who had worked on major investigative stories before. I poured everything out, my fears, my suspicions, the list itself. But instead of understanding, they looked at me with pity. "Listen," they said, their voice low and unsteady. "Some stories aren't worth it. The truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it chains you, drags you down until there's nothing left." I left that conversation feeling more alone than ever. It was clear I was on my own. Whatever decision I made now would be mine alone to bear. In the days that followed, I teetered on the edge, trapped between two impossible choices: to push forward and risk everything, or to turn back and carry the weight of these secrets in silence. I knew the risks. I knew the darkness that lay in wait. But with each day that passed, I found myself inching closer to the edge, the shadows pulling me forward, daring me to reveal what they had worked so hard to hide. Just when I thought the walls couldn't close in any tighter, I received an unexpected message. It was from a blocked number, but the sender had included a phrase that made me pause. "You're not the first to find the list." My pulse quickened as I read on. They wanted to meet. No names, no details, just an address and a time. I arrived at the small, out-of-the-way diner, its neon sign flickering in the evening gloom. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee and fried food. I spotted a lone figure in a corner booth, their face hidden in the shadows cast by a wide-brimmed hat. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure looked up as I slid into the booth, and I froze. It was the man who had spoken to me about Michael Jackson's final days, the one who had claimed to know the secrets that Michael had taken to his grave. His eyes were tired, but there was a sharpness in them that hadn't been there before. "You came," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't sure you would." "What do you know?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "About Michael, about the list." He glanced around, making sure we were alone before leaning in. "Michael was planning to go public," he said. "He had evidence, documents, recordings. He was going to expose everything. The control, the manipulation, the way they keep artists in line. He wanted to break the chains, not just for himself, but for everyone trapped in that machine." My mind raced, trying to process what he was saying. Why didn't he? The man's eyes darkened. He never got the chance. They found out. They always find out. He took a deep breath, his voice dropping even lower. Michael was trying to protect his legacy, his family, but he underestimated how deep their reach went. The night before he died, he was more scared than I'd ever seen him. He said he'd made a mistake, that he'd trusted the wrong people. The implication hit me like a punch to the gut. "You mean he was silenced," the man said bluntly. "Made to look like an accident, a tragic end to a troubled life. But it was no accident. Michael was too big, too influential. If he'd gone public, it would have brought the whole house down." I sat back, stunned. The pieces I'd been collecting suddenly snapped into place, forming a picture so clear and so horrifying. that I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it sooner. Michael Jackson had been on the verge of revealing everything.